What's up, painting friends? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Stoof. Today we're going to do a real-time acrylic painting tutorial for this right here. This painting is titled Smoky Mountain Sunset. We're using 11-inch by 14-inch canvas panel to complete this painting. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this painting tutorial. Alright, so I have the list of acrylic paint colors to recreate this painting in the description under this video. We have a few brushes you're going to need for this painting. You're going to need a filbert brush, a flat tip brush, and then two smaller flat tip brushes and a smaller round tip brush. To start this painting, I sketched out the horizon line. The horizon line is basically where land meets sky, and we have just kind of a bumpy little rigid horizon line there where the mountains in the far distance meet the sky. Next, I blended my titanium white with phthalo blue and some bright aqua green to get a nice blue sky color. After blending the color, I put that paint down on the canvas. There's a little bit of blue sky peeking through in the sunset scene, and the rest of the sky is mostly just like warm clouds. So I put that color down really quickly in those two sections. So basically between your horizon line and the top of your painting, that's where that's gonna go. And I didn't mention this before, but your horizon line should be about halfway between the center of your canvas and the top of your canvas. So like that top quarter of your canvas. Just using the flat tip brush to get that blue paint on the canvas there and going back and forth with the brush strokes. Next, I'm taking some pure white with a tiny bit dab of the cadmium-free yellow medium. I went a little overboard with the yellow, so I just took more white and calmed that yellow down a little bit. And I'm working quickly here. You don't want to put that blue down and wait 15 minutes before putting this white-yellow color down. You want to work that white-yellow color right into the blue. So you put it over top of the blue and go back and forth with your brush strokes, blending it into the blue a little bit so it gives a nice little hazy, blended connection. We want these clouds to look soft and puffy. We don't want to have super rigid, sharp lines where these clouds meet the sky. As you can see there, I'm kind of covering over part of that blue to make it look like we have some hazy clouds just kind of making their way up into the sky there. So your white plus yellow continues down a little bit more. I'm blending a hint of ochre in there as well, it looks like. Adding more yellow as we're moving farther down in the sky, warming things up more and getting more vivid with the color. You don't want to take your yellow all the way to the top of the canvas. There's a little bit of purple muted color at the very top from a cloud. So for that, we're combining magenta plus some burnt umber and some white just to get that very soft transition from the yellow to the cloud color, like the highlighted cloud to the shadowy part of the cloud. And then you can blend in some ultramarine blue and maybe even a little bit more umber to cool that down into the deeper shadow part of the cloud. And by making the top part of this canvas have like the deeper shadow part of the cloud, it helps draw your attention down more to the bright area of the canvas where our sunset is. So it's just another little thing that helps draw your focus in on that sunset. Just going back and forth with the brush strokes, not pressing too hard, keeping things light and fluffy, not making any sharp lines. Putting some more of that shadowy color under the yellow. Kind of going over it just a little bit to get that softer blend rather than putting two colors down next to each other. I put it a little bit over top of the color that's already down so that it blends it a little bit better and keeps that nice soft cloud look. I'm using the filbert brush here, and we're not pressing too hard. The lighter you press, the softer your blend will be. And if you have too much paint on your brush, that's also going to affect your blend. You want to have just a little paint on the brush when you're blending into the wet paint above it. Next, we're taking some cadmium red with a little bit of ochre, and we're getting a little bit warmer reds with our cloud color here, but still kind of in shadow. That's why we mix that red with ochre rather than more of our bright warm colors. And then here I started to blend a little bit more white and ochre, adding a little bit more of our yellow. So white, yellow, and ochre now. Adding this color right under that reddish color I did before, and you can see there the way I just put that paint on there, I held the brush stroke at an angle so that it could just overlap that red, and then once I overlapped it, then I went back with the brush and softly blended it, so not pressing too hard, just going back and forth with the brush stroke, and that's what gives you that nice soft cloud. Taking a little bit more of that magenta, blue and brown color, adding a little bit more white in there. Things are a little bit less saturated on the left side. Down here it's just kind of a cool purple that's kind of muted too, not very bold. And that just comes right down to our horizon line and about halfway in from left to right on the canvas. So now we got the left side of the sky mostly covered up the white paint on the canvas. Now we're starting to blend our red and yellow, warming things up and blending it into that purple color to get that really smooth transition. Again, not pressing very hard with the brush. Blending a little more white in there. And we're taking some red and yellow and just making a nice orange background here for the area behind where the sun will be setting. Add a little more yellow right to the section right where this behind the sun. We're not worrying about the sun yet because the sun is basically just pure white with a tiny dab of yellow, and that we're going to layer over the sky. So we're just focusing on the background for now. You just want to make sure you have a nice warm color behind that sun. Mixing a little more magenta in there for the side, softly blending. Just back and forth brush strokes. Now we're taking a little more red and yellow, continuing to warm up the area right around where the sun's going to be. And we're continuing to brighten up that area right behind where the sun will be. Just softly blending that up, adding a couple little highlights there, just mixing some white in. And I'm starting to warm up the cloud up at the top, starting to add some highlights as if the sun is illuminating this cloud up here too. Just in a couple little sections with a little bit of that pinkish color. Then we can put that brush away, switch to our smaller flat tip brush where we're going to take some white, mix it in with that yellowish ochre-y color, and mixing a hint of blue in there too. Just adding a little tiny hint of maybe there's some sky peeking through here, or maybe it's like a highlight, but there's just a little bit more going on over there. Adding some bright yellow for a little highlight on the cloud here. And starting to add some bright yellow mixed with white for some highlights on the clouds here where the sun is brightening up these clouds just at the bottom of each little section of cloud. And I'm holding this flat tip brush in a way that it's giving me that nice thin line. If I held it the opposite direction, like at a 90-degree angle, I would get a very thick line. So I'm holding it in a way to get a nice thin line. Here I'm just blending some red and white to get a few more little highlights in here on the left side. And this part you can kind of use your creative freedom and decide where you would like there to be some highlights on the clouds, because every set of clouds is going to look different. Mixing white with yellow and just adding a A couple more little highlights over the yellow that we already had down. And now we're just taking some pure titanium white and filling in a little circle using my small flat tip brush to create the sun. After putting that little bit of white down, I put a hint of yellow in there as well in the center part and kept the white around the rim. And then I started to add this little glow of red where the sun is setting just over the mountain, so it's making the mountain glow a warm red. So you're taking your cadmium red with like a little hint of yellow, but mostly red, and you're just putting that right under the sun there. Then we're taking the white and we're just adjusting the shape to make it look more like a perfect little circle there. If you want to blend out your sun and not have it be like a solid white circle, more like I did, then you could soften it up a little bit more too by letting that white dry and then add a little bit of white and yellow around the sun and kind of blend it out into the sky. And once you get the sun done, then it's time to start working on the mountains. So starting with the mountains in the farthest distance in the background, we're blending our magenta with our blues and white. As we're moving closer to the sun, we're going to start adding more magenta in, and then when we get to the area just below the sun, we're going to blend some cadmium red in. So the mountains keep getting warmer as they're moving closer to the sun. Another thing to think about here is value. Your mountains this far in the distance are going to have the least amount of contrast and the least amount of saturation. They're going to have more purples and blues in them, and then the mountains in the near foreground are going to have some really deep shadows, some brighter highlights, more greens and yellows in them. After getting that ridge line repainted, I started to add some white with a little bit of light blue violet, maybe a little ultramarine blue in there as well, and put that down and then slowly blended it up into the existing color for the ridge. This is taking up about 1 inch from top to bottom on the canvas here. This mountain peak that's visible, blending that white with a little bit of the blue up into the color. And then I feel like I got enough covered here, so we're going to start with the next mountain peak, moving closer. And for the shape of your mountain peaks, just keep these rigid little lines like I'm doing here. You want to get that ridge line first and then work on the color and the space below the mountain next. Make sure you aren't leaving any white space between the previous ridge line and the ridge line closer to the viewer. You want to completely cover up all the white space on your canvas. And it's okay if you paint over the wet paint a little bit and it might have a hint of a soft blend. You can always come back and sharpen up an edge later when the paint's dry, but it helps just to get that down. So we're starting to mix a little more phthalo blue in here, mixing some phthalo and white. The mountains have a darker ridge line and a lighter base. It's probably from like the haziness or any fog maybe that's rising up from the ground. It makes the bottom part of the mountains like lighter, misty, and then the top ridge line is always a little darker. So start with that darker color for your ridge and then blend in some white and more blue for the lower part, and then go back and forth with the brush like I am here until it blends up into the color that you had for your ridge line. Having a nice soft blend is going to be helpful in making this look more realistic. You don't want to have super choppy like pops of color unless your entire painting looks like that and that's just the style you're going for. Again, this is the part right under the sun, so we're blending a little bit more magenta, maybe like a hint of umber or cadmium red in there as well. And your value should be darker than the ridge line behind it. We're starting to mix a hint of phthalo green in there now too. Just starting to get a little closer into the green spectrum, away from the purple spectrum. And then we're ready to move on to our next mountain ridge line, coming closer to the viewer. Again, we want to go darker in value here than that lighter shade behind us. I'm adding one more little peak in there behind the one I put down. Making a little more purple because it's farther in the distance. Mixing some magenta and kind of touching up the sky. The mountain in the farthest background there, you don't have to have a super sharp edge for that one too. It could be a little fuzzy going into the sky, or you could keep a sharp line. I think either one would read accurately depending on, you know, what's going on with the sky and the fog there. To the ridge closer to the viewer, we're blending some burnt umber with some ultramarine blue and phthalo blue. A little phthalo green in there too. And you can see the value of this line is much darker than the ridge line behind it. And it's also more green in color. I'm figuring out how I want the ridge line to look. Blending a little more color there. You also can have steeper and more deep ridge lines in the foreground. Things in the background usually look less dramatic because they're so far in the distance. Blending a little bit more of my phthalo green in there and some light blue violet, just trying to lighten it up just a little. Mixing some white in there. Going back and forth and blending it softly up into the ridge color, being careful where I'm putting the brush so I'm not dragging the brush and putting a mark in the ridge line behind the one I'm working on. If you do make a mistake and you accidentally put some color on some other part of the painting that you thought you were done with, just let it sit and then you can come back, reblend the color that you want to be there, and then just layer it over top. It's one of the nice things about acrylic painting. The paint dries pretty quickly and you can just layer over any mistakes. Still figuring out how I want to shape this ridge line. Your ridge lines for the mountains don't have to be exactly like mine. You could make steeper ridges or less steep. You could space them apart more, space them closer together, make it look like you have even more mountains in there. Just fuzzing out that one edge and then readjusting my ridge line. Mixing a little more phthalo green with phthalo blue here. Maybe a hint of umber. Mixing some more white in there and just getting this little ridge I decided to put right there in. Just blending it up into that top color, top of the ridge. And then adding a little more of that white for the section below. Darkening up the ridge line a little more Using a little more ultramarine blue. Just defining that border and helping to pull it forward a little bit more from the one behind it. You can blend the dark color down into your highlight too. If you made the whole ridge a little too light, you can just take that darker color, start at the ridge, and then go back and forth with the brush to bring that darker color down, and it kind of brings the value down on the whole ridge there. Now I'm getting ready for the next ridge, moving closer to the viewer. This one starts on the right side, comes diagonally down with a couple little bumps in there. Here I mixed even more phthalo green, maybe some umber with the phthalo green as well. And we're blending some white in there. You can see the color's getting warmer now. More of like a greenish color than the blue color. We have more contrast with our highlights versus the shadows and the misty part of the mountain. And I'm still using my small flat tip brush here, but when you're moving closer to the foreground and you have this larger block of color, you can use a bigger brush and that would make things go more quickly. You just have a little less control. Starting to add a little bit more detail into the shadows and highlights of the mountain here as well. It's not just like a nice, smooth, perfect little blend. I'm keeping a little bit of shadows and ridges within the main ridge, like you have little drainage features that are starting to become visible, and we just start to add a little bit of shadow for that. Taking a little more phthalo blue with umber, maybe a little bit of phthalo green in there as well. And I'm starting to outline the next ridge, moving closer to the foreground, covering up a decent section from the ridge line behind it. Just trying to make a shape that will look realistic. Starting to blend in a little more white. After we get this ridge over to the edge there, then we'll add our colors with some white mixed in for the section below that, and just blend it up back and forth. It's a very repetitive process, same thing for each ridge line. Just remember that you're going to have a little bit darker ridge line with more color as you move closer to the foreground. Starting to add another little ridge over on the left side. We have a little river valley, or just like a regular valley between the mountains, just to the right of this ridge that I'm putting in here. You can see all of the mountains kind of come down at a slight diagonal, and then this one's gonna, on the left side, is gonna come down at an opposite diagonal that would create like an X if they intersected, but it's really just building this little valley. So we're just blocking that color in, getting that ridge line in there. And then this valley, we start to get a little bit more shadows in there as well. So things start to get a little darker now in the foreground shadows. In the background, we see a little more mist, and in the foreground, we have a little bit more like actual deep clear shadows, so we don't have as much mist in the foreground. You could add some more mist in the foreground if you'd like. That would make that painting look different than this one, but it would also read accurately. Building up one more little distant ridge that doesn't have too much detail, including more phthalo green. I'm continuing to add more phthalo green. A little bit of yellow is getting mixed in here too, just to warm up that green. Adding a little bit more detail, but still nothing too crazy. Not seeing individual trees yet. Using a little bit of vivid lime green in here as well, just to keep warming up that green. More phthalo green in the shadows. Just going back and forth with the brush, totally covering up all the white space, building up some deeper shadows with just some phthalo blue, maybe a little umber in there as well. Mixing a little more vivid lime green in there to warm it up. And now we're ready to do the trees closer to the foreground, like the hillside closest to the viewer. This one's actually second closest to the viewer. It's on the right side, comes down, and we can see individual trees here. So I'm taking my flat tip brush and just making some little tick marks like that, lifting the brush each time I put it down, drag the paint up, and then lift the brush. And it's creating these little pine trees. And you could do like a straight line or like your curved line for the hill slope first, and then go back and do these little tick marks to put your trees in there. Or you could just do what I did and just add the little trees and kind of make your line as you go. This is phthalo blue, burnt umber, and phthalo green. Maybe some ultramarine blue in there as well, but it's a really dark color. As you can see, this is much darker than the colors behind it. We're mixing more phthalo blue at the very bottom there. And there's a little bit more brown closer to the top. Once you get that little top tree line, you kind of just fill in the rest of that space there. And then we're going to take some vivid lime green and some phthalo green, a little bit of light blue violet too. And now we're just going to start to add a couple little highlights. This slope is mostly in shadow, so it's a really subtle highlight and it's not too warm. Just starting to add, just taking the brush and kind of bouncing it around, making it look like we've got a lot of plants covering this slope here. You don't have to go too crazy with detail or focus too much on one specific little section. This is not the focus of the painting, so as long as you get like a subtle little highlight in there, some little squiggles for trees, and some shadows, then you're good. Now we're going to move over to the right side where we can start to see like individual branches on, I don't know if this is a rhododendron or an azalea, but it's a really pretty purple flower bush that's just covering this hillside here. And it's got big, beautiful purple clusters of flowers, and you can see the individual leaves and branches on the bush here. So it's on the left side. It's going to cover up the rest of this canvas. I'm using my darkest colors I can make without using pure black. I didn't want to use too much pure black because I want to keep the color in there, and black kind of takes away your color. So we're mixing in our phthalo green with umber, or phthalo blue with umber, just getting a really dark, neutral, brownish blue green color. And I'm just using my flat tip brush, and I'm using that dark color to completely fill up the rest of this canvas. And while the paint at the bottom of the canvas is drying, I want those dark layers to dry, I'm working on the sky again. So I'm touching up the sun, just using pure white, brightening it up a little bit more right in the center. And then I'm taking some white with a hint of ochre in it maybe, and just doing a couple little highlights with my small flat tip brush, going back and forth, building up some more highlights, starting to add a couple more little cirrusy brush strokes that look like clouds, and giving things a little softer blend, adding a little more magenta with ochre and maybe a little bit of yellow in there too, building up a couple more little shadows and depth. There's just a big section of that super bright highlight at the top there, and I wanted to add a little more color to that so it's not just, you know, white. I want to add a little bit of something there, try to keep like a balance with the level of detail in the sky. Adding a couple more little highlights using my small flat tip brush on the bottom end of my shadowy sections. Kind of squiggling the brush around at a little angle, just building up those nice little highlights in there. And then once I get most of the paint off the brush, I use a dry brushing technique where I just kind of take that dry brush and do little swirls and soften up those clouds, make them nice and puffy. And then I'm just touching up the red glow of the mountain just below the sun. I wanted to soften that up and warm it up a little more, just to keep that focus right on the sun and help it to read accurately. And once I finished up the sky there, the bottom part was pretty much dry again, so we just come back. You can see there's still a glare from a little bit of wet paint, but it's mostly dry. So we're taking some vivid lime green, a little bit of phthalo green, a little bit of our yellow, and we're just taking our small round tip brush here and doing little ticks in little clusters, making like a little fan shape, and it's creating these little clusters of leaves. I'm not pressing very hard. I'm picking up the brush a little bit at the bottom part of these leaves too for each little leaf that I put down, and that's helping the leaves to look a little more natural and less bold. The lighter you press, the less color comes down, and if the paint below it is still a little bit wet, it might blend a little bit too. So practice using different pressure levels with how you're putting the paint on the canvas here, and see how when you put more pressure in the canvas, you're going to get a bolder, brighter leaf. And when you put less pressure onto the canvas with your brush, you're going to have a more subtle leaf. You want to get a little variety of this here. Basically the leaves on the far sides, on like the left and the top and the right, upper right, are lighter, and then everything at the bottom and the lower right are going to be darker because the sun's not quite reaching that section. So do your highlights that are really bright first, and then you can blend in a little more phthalo green and some umber and start to cool those leaves down as you keep moving farther down towards the bottom of the canvas. And it's a really repetitive process. First we just get all the leaves down, keep the ones at the top outer part the brightest, and then make the ones as you're coming down a little bit darker. Keep those little clusters with the little mini fan shape, and keep doing those little tick marks. You want your leaves at the very bottom left of the canvas to be super subtle, just barely at any value change between the shadow and the leaves. And make sure you leave like a good amount of dark space there where we're going to add some flowers later. You don't have to have perfect even spacing between each cluster. In nature, you wouldn't see a perfect symmetrical spacing of leaves, especially from this viewpoint here. Some would be overlapping each other a little bit. And once you get a good little cluster of leaves in there, you can leave a lot of dark space for now, and then we'll come back to it when we feel like we get a good balance. Then you can start adding some flowers. So we're going to start cool with the flowers, and then we're going to add some warm highlights. So starting cool, we're blending our Dioxazine purple with some ultramarine blue and a little bit of white, and just adding these little clusters of flowers. Now the flowers are a little bit rounder and less elongated than the leaves, but they're still forming in little clusters. And you could put some overlapping your leaves, you could put them right kind of in between a shadowy section of leaf and more leaf. But you just want to keep that little fan like pattern going for the flowers, and just make their shape be a little bit more rounded and just kind of like little blobs rather than elongated little brush strokes. And you could put flowers wherever you'd like. If you want less flowers, you can do less flowers and more leaves. I don't recommend doing more flowers because I kind of overdid the flowers. When you want to start warming up your flowers, the purples, you can use straight Dioxazine purple with white, not mixing any more blue in, and that'll give you a little bit warmer. And then when you want a super bright highlight for your flowers, you want to use magenta, just straight magenta, or you could mix magenta with your purple and white, and that'll also give you a warmer color. But if you want to cool down your purples, you're going to mix more blue in with the Dioxazine purple. If you want to warm up your purple, you're going to use more magenta. If you use your cadmium red, that's a little bit too warm, and it's going to take away from the nice vibrancy of the purple. It's going to make it look a little bit more like a sky cloud color than a bright, vivid purple flower color. So I would stay away from the cadmium red when you're trying to get these purple flowers, but if you have crimson, you could use crimson. That might work. I'm starting to add more flowers down here. These cool shadowy flowers have more ultramarine blue, a little bit of light blue violet might be in there too with the Dioxazine purple. And I'm just adding them in little clusters. Like I said, I added a lot of flowers to this one. And now we're going to come back and work on the leaves that are in shadow down here and the bottom part of the canvas. So we're taking some umber with some phthalo green. There's maybe like a little bit of sienna or a yellow or an ochre in there just to like make it more earthy and less vivid. You want your shadowy colors to have less saturation too, so I'm kind of counteracting the vivid color by mixing an earthy color in there, or one of the complementary colors that also makes it less vivid. So if you have green and you mix some red into it, it'll make it look more earthy, more like a brownish green. And I just kind of play around with this bottom part, starting to add a couple more little highlights and clusters, add a couple little shadows, deepen the shadows in some areas until I feel like I get a good balance. But that's basically it with this section in the foreground. Once we get these little highlights added in here, boost up some shadows in some places. Add the highlights on the flowers. Then we find a good balance, feel like we actually have some depth and it doesn't look flat anymore. Then we're basically done, guys. This one is a pretty straightforward painting. It's a less detailed, less complicated piece, so I was able to make this beginner level. Hopefully, if you just picked up a paintbrush, you were able to follow along. I tried to give a little bit more information about how to hold your brush and a little bit more info on color blending, so hopefully that helped you guys out. These little highlights are just covering up a portion of the flower that we already put down, that base color with the cooler color. The highlights are warmer and they're just covering up a section of the flower on each little cluster of flowers. They're not completely covering up that cooler purple we put down there. And then I start to blend in a little bit more of the cool colors as I'm adding highlights, getting closer to the bottom of the painting, because this part's a little bit more in shadow and just a little bit of sunlight is catching on these flowers. And as I mentioned before, here I'm just trying to get that balance and make the front section look less flat by adding a little more variation in the shadows, just putting a couple darker brush strokes in there in between the little leaves, and it's making it look more three-dimensional. It's not just looking like shadow with one round of highlights on top of it. Now we have a few other values mixed in there, so it builds up that depth of the bushes that we're seeing here. Next, I do a couple minor touch-ups, boosting the shadows in that hillside to the right behind the flowers. Starting to add a few more trees, making up and down and back and forth brush strokes there. Just making it look like we have some more actual bushes in there rather than just like squiggles. But still keeping it very loose and not the main focus of detail. And that concludes this painting. When you're done and you're happy with it, you just add your signature and you have a completed painting. Thanks for watching this tutorial, guys. I hope you enjoyed this one. This is a very colorful, happy painting to look at. It's not a very difficult painting, so that's why I labeled this one as a painting for beginners. Hopefully you guys were able to follow along. If you did recreate this painting, you're welcome to post it on social media and tag me, Steph Moraca Fine Art. I'm looking forward to seeing your guys' paintings. Have a great day and happy painting. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more of my painting tutorials.